Spend enough time on YouTube, and you'll come across someone arguing that you've been lied to your whole life. The Earth is not a globe turning on its axis orbiting the Sun. It is in fact flat and stationary. At first you're inclined to think this must be a joke. Surely no one in the 21st century really believes that the Earth is flat. But after watching some of these folks make their claims, you realize that this is no joke. Most of them are dead serious. But why would any rationally thinking person profess such a belief? The flat earthers themselves like to claim to be critical thinkers, and they toss out a lot of science to prove their points. Such claims are easily debunked and are usually readily dispatched by Simon Dan, Planner Walk, Dave McKeegan, and others. And yet the flat earthers keep coming, even when their ideas have been thoroughly dismantled. Of course, they never admit that. They pivot, and they begin talking about something else. So why aren't they persuaded by the obvious scientific evidence? Why do they persist in their curious belief, even when observation, math, and reason make their beliefs impossible? They persist because their objection to the globe isn't really a scientific one, however much they might use science or pseudoscience to back it up. Their objection to the globe is a religious objection. They can talk about refraction, curvature, density, and buoyancy all they want, but all of those things are really just cover for what is essentially a religious claim. The bigger problem, then, is that there is nothing in religion that requires you to believe in a flat earth, and much that encourages the faithful to embrace the findings of science and the reality that the earth is a globe. We'll look at the bad theology that is behind the belief in the flat earth on this episode of Some Theologica. All you have to do is watch flat earth videos long enough and they'll eventually tip their hand.
What if there is an actual creator? This place was designed for a purpose. This isn't an accident. Would your life change? We're all supposed to live in abundance. We're all supposed to be here for a purpose and learn and love and live. Being on a ball from an accident of a Big Bang, evolved from monkeys, that's no way to live. That's no way to perceive life. You're an accident. You have no purpose.
Here we see the fundamental complaint. Living on a globe, orbiting a star which is itself orbiting the center of the galaxy, which itself is moving in relation to the neighboring cluster of galaxies, which is moving away from the billions of other galaxies in the universe on unfathomable scales, doesn't do anything to make us feel special. And here the flat earthers give it away. They don't believe in the globe Earth because they don't want to. This is why you can't ever convince them of the science, even when they do it themselves. A couple of years ago, flat earther Bob Knodel attempted to use a $20,000 laser gyroscope to prove that the Earth didn't rotate. The results were not what he was expecting.
But what we found is when we turned on that gyroscope, we found that we were picking up a drift, a 15 degree per hour drift. Now, obviously we were taken aback by that. Wow, that's kind of a problem, right? We obviously were not willing to accept that.
We obviously were not willing to accept that. See, for all the science, for all the theorizing, all the $20,000 gyroscopes, the flat earthers simply won't believe in the globe Earth because it's never really been about science. It's about faith. So let's take a look at what exactly that faith has to say on the subject. The first 2 chapters of Genesis offer 2 different narratives detailing the creation of the world. The first narrative, running from the beginning of chapter 1 to the first half of verse 4 in chapter 2, describes a world created out of a watery abyss, with a dome of sky, waters above and below the earth, and the sun, moon, and stars placed on the interior of the dome. The second narrative, running from the second half of verse 4 in chapter 2 through the end of that chapter, describes the creation taking place on a trackless waste and differs greatly in the order of creation from the account in chapter 1. I deal with these creation narratives in much greater detail in my other video, The World Made Twice. But it is important to note that these narratives were based on ancient cosmologies very common in the ancient world. The Babylonians believed that the world had been created out of the carcass of the slain god Tiamat, mother of Marduk. Half was used to make the dome of sky. The other half of her corpse was used to make the earth. Her lover's blood was used to make humanity. The Egyptians believed the air god Shu, assisted by the ram-headed He deities, supported the sky goddess Nut as the earth god Geb reclined beneath. And the generally accepted ancient Israelite cosmology was that of a flat earth covered by a dome of sky called the Rakia, which means firmament or expanse, surrounded by waters above and below resting on pillars that went down into the great deep. This representation was not all that different from the other cosmologies of the ancient Near East. And it is fair to say that in some portions of Scripture, there are references to this underlying ancient cosmology. So we have only a handful of references that speak to anything like cosmology for us. And even then, they are contradictory or unclear. Is the earth on pillars, as in the Psalms and 1 Samuel, or is it hung upon nothing, as in Job? Is the circle over which God sits a disk or a sphere? Does the tree in Daniel really reach up to the heaven and touch the dome of sky, or is that just a poetic way of saying the tree of life is of ultimate significance? While it is possible to say that these verses support the idea of a flat earth, it is equally, if not more likely, to say that these verses are metaphorical, using commonly accepted understandings to make a figurative point. Because here's the thing. Ultimately, the shape of the earth in the Bible doesn't matter. Because, and I can't stress this enough, the Bible is not a scientific text. It is a religious text recording a people's experience with the divine. The facts serve the theology, not the other way around. If the biblical authors use concepts like the pillars of the earth, the dome of sky, or the corners of the earth, they did so because those concepts were familiar to their audience and helped them to make the deeper point about God. You could just as easily write a creation narrative today that would start with the Big Bang and that involved God causing rock to come together to be formed into the sphere of the earth. You could even leave the beginning as "Let there be light." And all of this is to say that using the scripture to defend the flat earth is placing too much of a burden on a text that was never meant to teach the reader about the shape of the world, as much as it was meant to teach about the nature of the one who made the world, whatever its shape. If anything, the religious traditions encourage the faithful to look to science and reason to understand the world. That's been happening for a very long time. It's important to understand that prior to the advent of the scientific method, philosophy was science. It was the application of reason to understand the world, and religious thinkers have been extolling the virtues of philosophy to do just that for a long time. 2,000 years ago, Philo of Alexandria used Platonic philosophy to argue that Judaism was an inherently rational faith based on rational principles. Many other religious thinkers throughout the centuries, like Saadia Gaon, Moses Maimonides, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, Anselm of Canterbury, and Thomas Aquinas, would all rely on Aristotelian philosophy to explore both their religions and their worlds. In fact, Aquinas used Aristotelian philosophy to undergird his theological masterpiece called the Summa Theologica.
Hey, that's the name of the show.
But what all these thinkers have in common is an assertion that the use of the tools of reason is not only permissible for a person of faith, they may be required. This idea can be traced all the way back to Jesus, at least, who stated that it was the first and greatest commandment to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. The 12th century Andalusian Islamic philosopher Ibn Rushd, one of the great philosophers of Muslim Spain and influential throughout the Muslim world and Christian Europe, wrote a theological defense of the use of philosophy to understand the world. He defined philosophy, or science, as the study of existing beings and the reflection on them as indication of the artisan. That is, all science is a method of studying what exists as a reflection of that which brought that thing into existence. Further, he took inspiration from the Quran, which commands the believer to understand the things they pursue. This leads Ibn Rushd to conclude that philosophy is at least encouraged, if not outright required, in Islam. We say, if the activity of philosophy is no more than the study of existing beings and reflection on them as indications of the artisan, and if the law has encouraged and urged reflection on beings, then it is clear that what this name of philosophy signifies is either obligatory or recommended by the law. Further, Ibn Rushd argued that philosophy should not conflict with the Quran because truth does not oppose truth, but accords with it and bears witness to it. This is an attitude about the scriptures that was shared by Maimonides in the Jewish tradition and Aquinas in the Christian tradition. Ibn Rushd argued that if there appeared to be a contradiction, then the interpreter should resort to allegory. That is, if science tells you the world is round and the scripture says it's flat, the scripture must be speaking metaphorically. It's important to note that Islam puts its money where its mouth was on the topic of faith and science. Islamic scholars like Muhammad al-Khwarizmi even developed entire branches of mathematics like algebra. In fact, so influential was al-Khwarizmi to mathematics that his name gave us the word algorithm. See, these Muslim scholars saw their use of science as an expression of their faith. In fact, they used science to help them practice their faith. One of the 5 pillars of Islam is daily prayer at certain times of day, at dawn, noon, mid-afternoon, sunset, and after dark. Muslim scholars have used their mathematics and keen astronomical observation to make calculations down to the minute for when a given place would experience the first light of dawn, when the sun would be directly overhead, and when the sun would set, among others. To this day, you can find highly accurate tables for your location that will give you all this information, so that you can be even more faithful in your observance of daily prayers. But even more astounding is this. Muslims are supposed to pray in the direction of Mecca for their regular prayers, and Muslim scholars have computed the precise direction for everyone on earth to pray. Surprisingly, it's not a generic face east when you're in the west or face west when you're in the east. The direction of prayer is in the direction of the shortest route from the individual to Mecca. And that is what we would call the Great Circle route. The same route that an airplane would take on its way from one point to the next. You get some surprising results when you calculate the prayer directions this way. From New York, Washington, and Chicago, you pray in a northeasterly direction, not the east-southeast direction you might guess when using a flat map. From Honolulu, you pray in a northwesterly direction, and from Rapa Iti in the South Pacific, you would actually face southwest, praying toward Mecca. All of this demonstrates that Islamic prayer is built around the fact that the earth is a globe. The directions for prayer only make sense on a globe. They don't make sense on a flat map, and they certainly don't make sense on the usual flat Earth map. And it doesn't even matter whether this flat Earth map is the one preferred by a given flat earther or not, because the prayer directions don't work on any flat map. They only work on a globe. Being religious does not bind you to some antiquated cosmology held by our Bronze Age forebears who barely journeyed outside their village. In fact, there is much in the religious traditions that impels you to use your God-given gifts to explore the world through science. As Galileo himself said, "I do not feel obligated to believe that the same God who has endowed us with sense, reason, and intellect has intended us to forego their use." Embracing science is the act of the faithful. In the same way, there is nothing about embracing science that should erode one's sense of wonder or beauty. As one scientist put it, there is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that while this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. That scientist was none other than Charles Darwin. But even leaving aside the fact that there's nothing in the religious traditions that requires a belief in the flat earth, that religious traditions actually embrace the use of reason and science, and that scientific understanding can be compatible with religious faith, there's still one outstanding problem that is at the crux of the religious objection to the globe. Remember our flat earther from the beginning? He said,
Being on a ball from an accident of a big bang, evolved from monkeys, that's no way to live. That's no way to perceive life. You're an accident. You have no purpose.
You can live on a ball, on matter that was created in a big bang. You can have evolved from monkeys and still have purpose. You can still find meaning in life. And here's the thing that really seems to be at the heart of this objection: you can still matter. You can still matter on a spinning ball, orbiting a star, hurling through space over incomprehensible distances in an infinite universe. You can still matter then. God is not bound by cosmology. In some ways, believing that you can only matter if you're living on a flat, stationary Earth is kind of blasphemous. Do you really believe that unless you're at the literal center of the cosmos, God will forget about you? Do you think that if there really is a galaxy far, far away, that God will want to spend more time there because it's cooler than our galaxy? Are you afraid that if space really is the final frontier, that we're all just so insignificant and of no concern to the Almighty? That sounds like a pretty lame God to me. That God isn't capable of creating even a flat Earth universe, let alone the awesome expanse full of wonder that is the cosmos. After all, isn't this the same God who numbers the hairs of your head and is mindful even of the sparrows when they fall? Can't this same God keep track of us, even if we're just living on one out of hundreds of billions of planets in the universe? On some level, embracing a modern cosmology makes faith that much more powerful. That even as a smarty-pants primate living on a spinning ball, orbiting an unremarkable star in a backwater part of the galaxy, among billions of galaxies in a universe without end, you are nevertheless beloved by the Creator of it all. How is that inferior to the belief that you're at the literal center of the cosmos? How is that not more powerful as a statement of love and grace? In the end, belief in a flat Earth is not rational. It's driven by a religious impulse or a deep-seated suspicion of authority and established institutions. But there is a more powerful religious impulse that moves us away from such fictions. The impulse to use the gifts of intellect and reason, the impulse to explore the creation with all the tools we have available to us, especially science, and to see the spinning globe adrift in an unfathomable cosmos not as cause for feelings of worthlessness and purposelessness, but as cause for wonder and awe.